Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining me, whether you are here with me live or you are watching the recording later on. Thank you for watching, right? Whenever you're watching. So we're looking at beating the machine today, right? We're talking about essentially just these hacks so you can get to the interview, right? Because I'm having you apply for these jobs, right? Everybody should be applying for jobs, and you all have been. And that's a really great thing, right? Because even if you don't quite find a job you want, or maybe you get a job but you have to turn it down because you like what you've got going on just a little bit better, or even if you don't get called back at all, right? Kind of going through the process and taking part in the process is making things easier for you in the future, right? The more practice you get at anything, the better off you are as you progress. And so what we talked about last week, right, was we talked about the best times to look for a job and why we would look for a job when we already had a job, right? We had a lot of good reasons for that. If you want to check that out, go back to last week's video and watch that. However, today I got another question. Last week, as you all were filling out job applications, I got the question of kind of how we could manipulate and work with the machine, if you will, right? Because we all kind of know that there is some sort of computerized wizardry going on the back end, right? That's doing some work with our resumes when we submit them, or our job applications when we submit them. So I want to talk a little bit about how we can work with those to get around it. So what exactly is this that we're talking about? What is this special software that we're talking about? Or they're called ATSs. So they're an ATS, or an applicant tracking system. And most job application sites that you see in the world use some form of an ATS. And essentially what this ATS does is it pre-screens potential employees to see if they're a good fit for the role, right? So we can kind of look at it like a robot, right? We have some sort of artificial intelligence that's been given some sort of model, right? Some sort of set of criteria to be looking for. And then, it's going to kind of screen our job applications and see if we're that fit that we claim to be. And so how exactly does this work, right? Our ATS parses a resume's content into categories, right? Like that's one of the first big things, right? So when you divide your resume up, right, as you've kind of seen examples of resumes, you're dividing a resume up into categories: work experience, education, whatever else, right? And so it can see these headings, and it can take the information that is beneath these headings, and it can scan it and pull out keywords. And essentially what it does with those keywords is it defines a score for you, right? So it's looking for specific keywords that it finds in specific sections of your resume as it parses the resume, and it assigns you a score. Typically, some kind of like score like you'd receive on an assignment, right? Something that goes from like 0 to 100 based on how many keywords you have, and whatever other criteria that has been defined by the employer to fit into this sort of machine learning model to kind of weed through different applicants. And then, the employer can request the top 10, the top 5, the top however many they want, right? Based on the scores that this ATS assigns to them. So you might think, well, why would employers use this, right? Like, why would they do this if they know that, it's just a computer and it could probably be gamed or uh, whatever, right? Like some good people are going to fall through the cracks if we use this. Well, I mean, you got to kind of think about it in the way an employer would, right? Like, especially the more you work with applying for jobs and applying for jobs online this semester, one of the things that you'll notice, especially as you get more experienced with it, that applying for a job online is easy. It's easy and it's available to everyone in the entire world. Right? So whereas if you had to fill out a paper application or send in a paper resume, right, you might only get people within a certain geographical area or only people who actually know about the existence of this business sending resumes and applying for this job. So, if we're doing everything analog and we're doing everything on paper, that alone is a limiting factor for how many applicants you'll get. But when you do as we've done here and we take our job application systems and we move them to the internet, we make them pretty easy to complete, and we open them up for a much larger group of people to be able to find and apply for these jobs. Right? So if you didn't pre-screen in any way, even in the manner that the ATS does, you could end up with thousands of applicants to try to pour through and read their resumes and work with by hand. I mean, could you imagine being the hiring manager who has to go through and look at thousands of resumes? So you need something to narrow down that applicant pool. And, even though the ATS isn't necessarily a perfect system, it's about the best we've got at the moment to be able to weed through this big applicant pool and try to pull out the best of the best, the cream of the crop. But as you can probably tell, right, that could leave some people who don't necessarily know the tricks of the ATS, who are otherwise good in writing a good resume. That could leave them out in the cold, right? That could allow them to fall through the cracks. Just because they didn't know how to game the ATS well enough, so their score that they receive falls out of the top 5, 10, however many they want to look at. And so it takes somebody who really would be really good for this role and pushes them out. So that's why I wanted to talk today about some things that you can do with your resume as you're applying for jobs to get past this stage, to raise your score in the ATS, and to hopefully be able to get to more interviews. And the first hack is the way that you format your resume. Remember that when you upload your resume into an applicant tracking system, into any of these job application sites that you're seeing nowadays, it's highly likely that the hiring manager will never see that file. Ever. Right? Even if you make it to the next stage, right? They'll get some sort of formatted version that was created by the ATS. Because remember that we said the ATS parses the document and it parses the document into this sort of digital profile. Right? So it takes your information from the resume and makes it into something that's more uniform and searchable across all candidates. And so I know this is something that breaks the heart of my, design students out there. Because it's primarily affecting you. Right? But in general, like this resume formatting and breaking down of a resume into a digital profile causes a lot of problems, right? Because we try to get too fancy, right? Like you've probably seen a lot of those really fancy resumes out there with like the graphs for like, oh, I've been using, Python for 6 years, and I have this little graph showing you how well I know it, and it looks pretty, and that's awesome if you can get that into the hands of a human being. But when you're putting it into one of these ATS, it's not going to be able to parse that data. Right? These ATS parsing algorithms, they're old and they're not particularly smart, right? So they're just looking for these big headings and for the information that falls underneath those big headings. So if you try to make one of these fancy, well-decorated, beautifully designed resumes, that information's going to not get carried over into the way that you want it to be carried over, right? It's not going to communicate to that ATS auto parser the way that it would communicate to a human being. And even though, we tend to like things that look nice, right? The first big hack of being able to kind of get past the ATS is to have a very simply formatted resume. Simple, plain, no frills, just top to bottom listed out there. Black and white, simple font that'd be easily readable by the machine. Boring, for lack of a better word. Right? Even though it doesn't look that nice to you, it's not really supposed to look that nice. Right? We want to be able to get it past this ATS. So we just kind of have to make our resume formatting a little bit boring. Now we still want to make it nice and neat, right? Like we don't necessarily want to make it ugly. Because while it is unlikely that the hiring manager will ever view the file, there are some situations in which they might. So trying to make something that's purely machine readable isn't the best thing to do either. Just something that a human can easily read without a lot of extra unnecessary clutter that a machine would have to parse through is going to be ideal for formatting your resume. Hack number 2 is to use your resources. So when you're crafting your resume, right, and you should write at least a slightly different resume for every job that you apply to, go in and edit it, add some pertinent things that are specific to that position. You're supposed to be crafting it for the job you're applying to. And including these keywords that the ATS is going to pick up on to raise your score. Now, you might be thinking, well, I don't know what keywords they're looking for. How could I possibly know what keywords that they put into the ATS that they're looking for? This must just be some kind of blind guessing game, right? Wrong. The job description, where you found the job posting, is the cheat code for finding the keywords to put in your resume. So, for example, if that job description is asking for somebody who is used to working with Cisco routers and switches, talk about what you did with Cisco, specifically Cisco routers and switches, at a particular place or in your education or somewhere in your resume. Right? If it's asking for somebody who knows how to write Java or Python or whatever, specifically put that programming language in your resume. Right? Like here, this is a job description. This is that data center operator position that I posted to the class just the other day. right? And we can look here at the role of an operator, and in the role of an operator, we can start to pick up things that would be good keywords to use to apply for this job. Install and configure computer hardware and software systems. Monitor computer systems and networks to ensure they function efficiently. Communicate with clients over the phone. Troubleshoot network and system problems. Deploy software and firmware. Establish and maintain positive trust relationships with customers and data specialists as system administrators. Right, as we read through this, some words jump out at us. Right, like we see data center hardware, computer hardware, software systems, deploying software. We see these terms pop up time and time and time again. So when it comes to things that are going to be significant for getting around the ATS for this job, these are your keywords that you want to include. You can take your keywords and you can pull them right out of the job description, find a way to fit them into your resume, and then it'll see those keywords in your resume and raise your score. Right? And it is looking for those specific keywords. So this is something, as you're reading the job description, just make a few notes, right? Just make a few notes at the big keywords that pop out at you. Things that it says are super important for you to be able to know or do, right? When you look at the KSAs for a particular job, the knowledge, skills, and abilities, what are the things that the job description says are important? Or what are the things that the job description keeps bringing up time and time and time again? Right? These are your indications that these things are probably keywords. And you can put these keywords in your resume. You want to put them in there, kind of naturally, right? Like you don't want to just shoehorn some keywords in there just to have some keywords in there, because that'll cause a problem too. We'll see that in a minute. But you want to put your keywords in there and specifically talk about your experience with this keyword, your experience with that keyword, your experience with this other keyword, instead of just talking generalities. Because the ATS is going to be looking for that, and that's what's going to raise your ATS score. Another thing is to not be clever. Don't be clever. Don't be clever, right? Like, again, this goes back to the idea of, we want to kind of impress the humans that are reading this, but first we have to impress the computers that are reading this. So our computers, they don't have a great sense of humor, right? They don't, they can't read tone. They can't read colloquialisms, right? Like, we might want to try to be clever and appear friendly and say something like where I've been instead of work experience. But the computer is not looking for a section called where I've been. It's probably looking for a section called work experience. Right? We have to be able to standardize this language. We have to be able to, again, it's boring, right? It's boring. And when we talk about making ourselves stand out and making ourselves different from the pack, having this boring seeming resume doesn't really do that. Right? But remember, we have to impress the computer first, and the computer is more impressed with what we say than the manner in which we say it. Right? It's looking for those keywords. It's looking for what has been defined as important for this job. So, don't get too clever cute with it, right? The next thing is save and submit as a Docx. PDFs are a bit of a pain, right? Again, this is something that's good for human readers, right? Because you can embed fonts and things like that. into a PDF, and the visual of it can look the same when someone else opens it as it does when you open it. But again, we're in a situation here where we're not concerned about visuals. We're concerned about a computer being able to read and understand this document. And the algorithm has a great time with Microsoft Word documents. So when you're submitting your resume, it might give you an option to submit it as a PDF or a Word doc. Submit it as a Word doc. All right, the Word doc is going to be much easier to parse than a PDF document is. Next hack is to not overdo it. Right? Like, it's a good idea to go in, and we kind of talked about that. It's a good idea to put in these keywords if you can put them in naturally and kind of talk about how you worked with them. Right? One of the best things you can write in a resume is if you can talk about a keyword and a metric. A keyword and a metric. Meaning I can talk about something that was specifically written in the job description, and I can talk about how my work impacted that keyword thing at my current role to the end of a metric. So, like, say they want somebody who's familiar with DevOps or server scripting, right? And you can talk about how you wrote DevOps scripts that deployed servers at a rate that was 20% quicker or whatever, right? Like, I'm just kind of coming up with garbage off the top of my head right here. You want to include that keyword and then what you did with that keyword, but to make that even better, if you can have some data with that keyword about how what you did successfully improved this, or you were able to increase sales by this because of that, or whatever, right? Like, that's going to be super huge. Well, what you don't want to do is you don't want to overdo it. You don't want to just go shoving keywords in there without context, just kind of shoving keywords in there when they don't make sense, because this is something that some people will do to try to trick the ATS, and then they'll get in trouble. Because one, looking for keyword cramming is part of the algorithm, right? So they're going to be looking for you putting keywords in there without context. And that can actually reverse and lower your applicant score. Because it's more easy to detect than you might think programmatically, right? Because I'm just going to be looking for words that are beside other words. And so if I can't find some words near another word, or I'm finding too many strange words in proximity of another word, then I'm going to know, they're probably just shoehorning keywords in here that don't make sense. Right? But even if it gets past that, eventually it's going to go to a human, and a human's going to read it if it gets past that, right? So at that point, if you just kind of crammed keywords in there without context, then what you've done is you've made a resume that the machine will read, but then when it gets to a human, it'll look like you were filling out, information technology Mad Libs, right? Just random words in between other words, which is less than desirable. You want your resume to be both human-friendly and computer-friendly, so you want to strike a delicate balance there. And so, again, being able to include the keywords and provide context into what you know about them and what you've done with them with metrics, if they're available, is the best way to go. And I got one more hack, and this is probably the biggest one. Right? And it's probably also going to be the one that we are going to be least likely to want to do, and that is to pick up the phone. Hack 6 is to pick up the phone. Right? Because we said, by default, the hiring manager is only going to go in there and they're going to get a list of the top 5 or 10 or whatever that the ATS recommends. But if you want to skirt that, if you want to end around that, if you think maybe you didn't do enough to work with the ATS, or maybe you just want to make a connection to try to get in there and skirt around that ATS and not have to worry about it so much, find out who the hiring manager is. It's typically easy to do, right? Like if we look at this job description here, tells you to get in touch with Madison Muscat, right? So you have a person there. So if you can find out who the hiring manager is, the person who's hiring for this job, and typically you can use LinkedIn, maybe sometimes Facebook, maybe various other different, sometimes it'll list it in the job description. If you can find out who the hiring manager is and send them a call or send them an email or just give them a quick call. Right? You don't want to bother them. You don't want to inundate them with messages. You don't want to email them or call them more than once. And you just want it to be short and sweet. Right? Introduce yourself. Tell them that you applied. List off a couple reasons why you'd be a good candidate. Just really simple, really quick, like less than a minute. We talk about an elevator pitch a little later on in the course, right? Just quickly give them your elevator pitch. And there you go. And if you make a good impression on them, they'll remember you. They'll remember having this conversation with this person who, seemed to be really interested in the job and, really wanted them to know about, what they could do and what they had to offer to the company. And so even if you're not in the top 5, they might go in and look for that resume. Even though you might fall out of the regular things that would make that keyword score high, they'll go in and look for you. And they'll find you and they'll pull you out and they'll actually read your resume. You'll have a human being reading your resume. Because the big thing there is to make a connection, right? If you make a connection and you impress them, you have an in. And that's significant. Right? Because if you can get to a human and you can get a human to open up and read your resume, your ATS score does not matter at all. Which is great. So that's basically the end of this. That's all that I have for you for today. We try to keep these streams about 30 minutes or so, keep them relatively shorter. So I hope this answered some questions for you all. We'll turn the music back on and we'll just play the music for a bit, just in case anybody here with me live has any questions. But again, that's all that I have for you for today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.